think the title is self-explanatory. Albums that have left a negative legacy, that are considered, if not the worst, certainly among the worst of each band. Also, artists that are well-known, big names in the genre they serve. So many of the albums you'll see here are kind of expected. And the big question, are these albums as bad as we remember them to be, as they are still today considered by the musical establishment? Before I start, I'd like to say that in the presentation of each album, I include its rating on Rate Your Music and Metal Archives. Both are global sites with a long-standing presence in the field where reviews are written by users. So we also get an idea of what the fans think about the albums. The general assessments and opinions you will hear are obviously purely personal. At the end of each section, I also give my verdict, which is my opinion in a brief and concise way. Let's see what comes out. I know I could have chosen others, Forbidden, for example, but I chose this because we're talking about the classic lineup, and we're talking about an album that still divides the band's fans today, and not without reason. It was created under special circumstances. Besides the massive amounts of alcohol and drugs the band was consuming, singer Ozzy Osbourne had temporarily left the band. They had found a new one, and they had written songs with him that when Ozzy finally returned, he didn't even want to hear about singing them. As a result, they would write songs in the morning and record them in the afternoon, with the singer often rejecting bassist Geezer Butler's lyrics, which led to hasty rewrites. They had chosen a studio in Toronto for tax reasons, which they realized didn't suit them, but they couldn't change it. They also produced the record themselves, and as they admitted later, they had no idea what they were doing. The result is one of the strangest albums ever made by a major rock band. It's a record that practically condenses 10 years of music history into 9 songs. You've got punk garage, you've got prog, you've got psychedelia, you've got jazz, you even have blues in the last track. The one thing you almost completely lack is the classic Sabbath sound. How do I like the album? I don't know, it's a very strange release. I really like the title track, as well as Johnny Blade. Air Dance is very special, but probably in a good way. Breakout, which has been so divisive, is actually a 2-minute instrumental with jazz elements, because Ozzy didn't want to sing the original song. Swinging the Chain, on the other hand, is like the 1969 Black Sabbath covering Deep Purple with Bill Ward on vocals. And I can't decide if it's genius or a massive failure, which sums up my opinion of the whole album. You were expecting it, weren't you? The record which cannot be named for extreme metal fans everywhere. An album that the world hated so much that, despite the very honest vanity nemesis that followed, it led to Celtic Frost disbanding for 15 years. The Swiss masters who consistently surprised us positively with each new album, who always had something new to offer and suggest, who had influenced and would influence hundreds of other bands worldwide, were playing glam metal. But wait for a moment, was it really like that? Now that I've listened to the album again, I'd say no. Perhaps the only track that falls into the glam metal category is Cherry Orchards, which reminds me more of Black Sabbath and Merciful Fate than Motley Crue, and which, in my opinion, is a killer song. From there on, we have either thrashy heavy metal or heavy metallic thrash, depending on how you look at it. Some have called it proto-blackened glam metal. The first 3 tracks aren't that far off from the previous album, Into the Pandemonium. Juices like wine. Sounds like Celtic Frost covering Armored Saint. Yes, production has issues. The band didn't want to end their collaboration with the famous producer Tony Platt, AC/DC, Cheap Trick Foreigner, despite him not being a good fit, because they finally wanted a big name to work with them, and they ultimately paid the price. Yes, frontman Tom Warrior's growls and his attempt at catchier choruses don't go together. But this is not enough to make the album nearly as hated as it generally is. Warrior has repeatedly tried to distance himself from the release, saying that because he was in the mood to have a good time, he let the rest of the band take control, and that led to these radical changes in content and image. After a decade of continuous rise in global dominance, the band makes some important decisions. This album will be simpler and more direct than the previous ones, reminiscent of the albums they made at the beginning of their career, and it will be recorded at bassist Steve Harris's home in Essex. At the beginning of the recordings, the big shock, guitarist Adrian Smith, burned out from constant touring and unable to contribute to the songwriting in any way, leaves the band and is replaced by Janet Gers, effectively the singer, Bruce Dickinson's immediate collaborator on the solo album he had just released. The album does indeed contain shorter durations and simpler structures. And in some cases, this works. Tail Gunner, Holy Smoke, The Assassin, Hooks on You. While in others, Run Silent, Run Deep, Public Enema Number 1, Fate's Warning. It backfires as the tracks seem unfinished. This is most noticeable in the album's two most epic and ambitious songs, the title track and Mother Russia. I think these two in particular would have benefited from a longer song duration. Generally, it seems to me here that Iron Maiden is a band trying to do something that isn't working for them, and they should have realized this before it was too late. The main reason for me is that the Iron Maiden of 1990 are not the band of 1981. According to Steve Harris, the album that served as a guide was Killers, but the people who played on Killers were different, not only as individuals, but also as characters. So, to put it simply, how do you make Killers without Paul Di'Anno? So the album remains more of an interesting oddity in the band's catalog rather than a resounding failure. It's 1992. Helloween are entering the studio feeling like they've just missed the biggest opportunity of their career to become the new Scorpions. Their previous album, Pink Bubbles Go Ape, changed the band's character and left a bittersweet taste in the fans' mouths, while the fact that it was delayed by a year and a half due to legal issues also caused them enormous damage. Having accumulated a debt of nearly 2 million marks, they decide to write something very commercial to get rid of it. At the same time, the atmosphere in the band isn't the best either. The two main composers, guitarist Michael Wycath and singer Michael Kiske, don't communicate with each other. Drummer Ingo Schwichtenberg is on the verge of a nervous breakdown, while the relatively new guitarist, Roland Grapow, doesn't know exactly what the band wants him to write. Result: the album sounds like 3 solo albums, one by Kiske, one by Wycath, and one by Grapow put together. For example, the first 4 tracks sound like they come from 4 different bands, typical Helloween happy metal for the first, almost AOR for the second, ABBA-esque pop for the third, and jazz hard rock for the fourth. And the whole album is like that. Just when you find something you like, something else comes along and completely changes your impression. The world wasn't ready for such things at that time, and certainly not Halloween fans. The album was a complete failure and led to the collapse of the lineup with the dismissal of Kiske and Schwichtenberg. And yet, when I listen to it today, it seems like an excellent display of variety and talent, just completely misplaced, expressing something that no one wanted to hear at the time, at least not from Halloween. I think it's worth a second chance, as long as you're prepared for variety and unevenness.
Don't tell the kids. Don't waste your time.
An album that music historians categorized as a despair record, meaning the various awkward attempts made by traditional metal bands in the 90s in order to stay relevant and keep up with the times. This album is often considered as the weakest of Dio's band, or according to some, the weakest of Dio's entire career in rock, dating back to the Elf era. When Ronnie wrote it, he was probably pissed off about various things that were happening at the time. Logically, he still couldn't digest how the Black Sabbath lineup for Dehumanizer fell apart, especially when he saw that Black Sabbath weren't going anywhere at that time. That's why the album has a very, very angry atmosphere, possibly influenced by what was popular in rock at the time, namely grunge, groove metal, etc. Of course, don't think it's not a Dio album, okay? And to be honest, I like a lot of things in it. Okay, it is Ronnie trying to play modern stuff, and it is a Ronnie who, after the fairly good impression of previous work, Strange Highways, continues to move away from the magical paths of the 80s and trust the more peculiar, almost dissonant sounds of guitarist Tracy G, which practically means it sounds like Dio being the frontman of Soundgarden. For example, Stay Out of My Mind sounds like a song cut from Super Unknown. And if we get past the initial shock, this is not as bad as it sounds. The two openers, Institutional Man and Don't Tell the Kids, as well as Dying in America and Double Monday, are awesome. Black is a bad choice, and maybe even Big Sister, I admit. They don't suit him. In Hunter of the Heart, he tries to combine his old with his new style, and well, it's not as bad as it sounds when you say it. And I think it's fair to say that the album was not considered a complete failure because of its content, but rather because of the abysmal sales. So, my opinion is that no surprise here either, right? Slayer with low tunings, murky chords, groove and breakdowns, and Araya almost rapping in some instances. Yes, this is the Californian band's new metal album. Or is it? You see, externally, things might seem that way. But if we look closer, it's definitely not that simple. I would say that here Slayer become more experimental than ever in their career, highlighting dissonance more than the angst and aggression of new metal. I would also say that as they adapt to the new realities, they are also adapting the new realities to themselves. Guitarist Jeff Hanneman said the album turned out that way because he wrote a lot more of it himself, while the other guitarist, Kerry King, claimed he didn't pay much attention to the record because he was angry with what was considered popular in heavy music at the time. Both of them tried to figure out where Slayer fit into the music of the era. In the end, it's like they told the young guns, we'll try to do it, but in our own way. For example, I don't think many new metal bands had a drummer who played like Paul Bostaff does here. Does it always work? Not exactly. When they are approaching the old stuff and tracks like Bitter Peace, reminiscent of South of Heaven, Desire, close to Dead Skin Mask, Scrum, or the last two songs, then everything is fine. When they shift to mid-tempo rhythms, you get what the English speakers call a mixed bag, from the very aggressive but nothing more in the name of God, to Stain of Mind, where the Californians borrow from Sepultura, and the almost rapping of Love to Hate. It is not always consistent and not always successful.
Butterfly.
It's 1998, and the popularity of Scorpions isn't at its peak. Their previous album, Pure Instinct, received heavy criticism for containing too many ballads. The genre they've been playing since at least 1979, melodic, catchy hard rock slash heavy metal, is completely out of fashion, so for their next album, they decide to change things up a bit. They collaborate with producer Peter Wolf, responsible for mega hits like We Built This City, who convinces them to follow the trends of the time, which were alternative music, EDM, or hip hop. They almost completely eliminate heavy guitars from their sound and give us a clean pop rock, which, if it didn't have the modern production of the time, we would say takes us back to the good old days of early 80s pop rock and AOR. I think you can tell from the cover that something different is happening here. We are also in a transitional period for the band, so the focus is entirely on the trio of Mina, Schenker, and Jabs, with the new members Riekerman and Kotek in the background. These are certainly strange times for bands like the Scorpions, but I don't think anyone would have expected the album's first single, the incredibly catchy To Be Number One, to be reminiscent of 1984 Prince. Neither the Eastern psychedelic Mind Like a Tree, nor the band's only German language track, Du bist so schmutzig, in which drummer James Kotek almost raps, but which works surprisingly well. The thing is, no matter how you look at it, while it's good to take risks, you shouldn't overdo it. And here, the Scorpions overdo it. Very quickly, each song sounds the same as the next, and even the most well-intentioned listener loses interest. It's no coincidence that the best track on the album is also the heaviest, Yellow Butterfly. So,
More deadly than mine.
in January 1999, Megadeth entered the studio to record their next album. The initial idea was that it would be 50% like their 1986 album Peace Cells and 50% like their previous album Cryptic Writings, according to frontman and bandleader Dave Mustaine. But things would not turn out that way. In a conversation he had with Lars Ulrich, the drummer of his sworn enemies, Metallica, he heard the Dane tell him that Metallica always took risks with their music and that he should do the same. And so, he accepted the challenge, decided to change everything, named the album Risk, and completely restructured the band's sound. Also, due to the great success of the song Trust from Cryptic Writings, he decided to blindly trust the duo of manager Bud Prager and producer Dan Huff, who had helped him write the track. So he gave them more control over the project. For example, the manager received composer credits on 5 out of the album's 12 tracks. As a result, the album sounded like it had been made by a different band. Megadeth practically chases a Trust Number 2 for an entire album and almost completely abandons its aggressive side. The truth is, they will have another big hit with the anthemic Crush 'Em, which became a favorite in sports arenas across America. From there on, ideas are not lacking, but balances. What made Cryptic Writing so good was that the alternative tracks were interspersed with authentic metal songs, which kept the listener's interest high. The thing is that, at some point, just like on the Scorpions album, you start to get bored. Anyway, there is some good stuff here. Definitely Prince of Darkness, the album's highlight, but also Breadline, Ecstasy, the two time tracks, and even Crush 'em in all its simplicity.
Am I who I think I am?
Obviously, it had to be here. A very special album in every way. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Some Kind of Monster about how it was made. If so, you will understand a lot. If not, I'll give you a summary. In 2001, the band entered the studio without a bassist, and in the worst phase of its history in terms of relationships between members. James Hetfield went to rehab and returned in early 2002 with the explicit instruction to work in the studio for only 4 hours a day. Plus, a producer, Bob Rock, who for his own reasons left the band completely unchecked, blindly accepting whatever they decided. And of course, the incredible choices in sound. New metal-style, down-tuned guitars. Drummer Lars Ulrich, who forgets to open up the snare drum during a studio session. And when he hears what was recorded, he likes it and keeps it for the entire album. And of course, the choice to have no solos. It's a record that seems to have been deliberately made so bad and shows Metallica pushing the boundaries of noise rock. We have the 17 different riffs of Invisible Kid. We have the incredibly annoying verse in Shoot Me Again, and the cacophony at the end of the title track that makes my ears bleed. We have the blues thrash of Sweet Amber, with Hetfield's screams in the chorus that seem to have no reason for existing. And many, many more. And yet, amidst the chaos, there are also good ideas. Frantic, Some Kind of Monster, and Dirty Window, for example, are good for almost their entire duration. When played acoustically, All Within My Hands was quite nice, because the heavy version is unbearable. If this album were ever reissued with a different remix, perhaps we would say different things. But here, we're talking about Metallica. They didn't remix and Justice for All. I mean, they'll never go for something like that. If you look at the ratings, you'll see that this album has the worst ratings of all the ones I presented. However, if you read the Wikipedia articles for all 10 albums, you'll find that it also has the best reviews, 4.5 out of 5 from Blabbermouth, 9 out of 10 from Metal Hammer, etc. So what happened? What happened is that one of the greatest death metal bands of all time decided to try something different. Something very different. We're talking about industrial death metal with elements of electronic music. Now, you're going to tell me maybe it's an album in the style of Seventh Star that was intended to be a solo album and was given the band's name for commercial reasons. Probably not. Since 2/3 of the band's classic core, singer Dave Vincent and guitarist Treya Zagthoth, are here. The only one missing is drummer Pete Sandoval. Okay, is the album light? Does it lack aggression? No, it's quite aggressive, just in the way bands like Static X are aggressive, for example. So why so much hate? Because a band with a name that carries so much history and has built a very large critical mass of fans over the years often finds itself trapped by its own success. I understand that Treya Zagthoth, who was responsible for the sound of death metal almost as much as Chuck Schuldiner of death, was listening to other things back then, and that's what he wanted to express through his music. Through tracks like Destructo's versus the Earth/Attack, Too Extreme or Radicult. The problem is that with such tracks, the fans thought he was making fun of them or trolling them. If you want me to give an objective opinion for the casual, extreme, non morbid Angel music fan, I would say that it isn't an album that deserves so much hate. Its main drawbacks are its length and the lack of cohesion. Oh, yes. And the fact that it says Morbid Angel on the cover.